Hey guys, welcome back to Matt Keeps Fish. In this video, we're talking about quarantine tanks and fish parasites, so stay tuned. So what is a quarantine tank? Well, a quarantine tank is basically just another tank. It doesn't necessarily have to be that small. Actually, this could be the quarantine tank and this could be the display tank, but it's a little cheaper to have the quarantine tank as something smaller because you're not really using it for display purposes. As you can see, mine just has some plastic plants, it has a bare bottom, it's got a sponge filter. It doesn't look that great, but it's just there to serve a purpose. So what functions does a quarantine tank have? Well, first of all, it's nice to put new fish in there just so they can get adjusted to your water without also having to adjust to all the other fish you have in your main display tank. Apart from fish illnesses, there is also the issue of aggression, and the quarantine tank, little isolation aquarium, is good for dealing with that, because say you have some really aggressive fish or even slightly aggressive fish and you want to reorder the hierarchy. So for instance, let's say we have peacock cichlids. With peacock cichlids, they like to have a hierarchy of the most dominant fish all the way to the most subdominant fish. Sometimes one of these cichlids will try to climb the ranks and challenge the most dominant fish, or they'll try to bully the most subdominant fish into near death, and you don't want that happening. To fix this, what you can do is you can take the most dominant fish, or whatever the most aggressive fish is, doesn't necessarily have to be the most dominant, and you put it in your quarantine tank. Now sometimes all it takes is a little bit of time alone for the fish to settle down, but another great option is you can put it in that quarantine tank and in the meantime rearrange the display tank so that when it goes back, it doesn't recognize the territory, because a lot of these aggressive fish are mainly aggressive because of territorial reasons. Another reason that fish become aggressive is for breeding reasons. Some male fish are really aggressive during breeding, and sometimes it can kill the female. So you can use your quarantine tank either to separate that male out and put him in there for some quiet time, or you can put the female in there, especially if she's got eggs, as it's a safer place to have the eggs or the live young. Now we move to the main reasons that you would have a quarantine tank, and those are for fish illnesses. These include bacterial infection, fungal infection, I'm sure there's more out there, and of course parasitic infestation. Parasites are the reason that I'm making this video on quarantine tanks, because I believe that they most deserve the use of it. So let's backtrack. Why do I have a quarantine tank? If you watch my earlier videos, namely in the 2020s and the early 2021s, I actually was really against quarantine tanks. I thought that the best thing to do was just put the fish in there and treat them all together. Why not, right? If you have the money, might as well do it that way. There were times where I would put my fish through like a 10-gallon planted aquarium for a few weeks and then I'd put them in the main tank, but slowly I stopped doing this and I forgot the reason that you even needed to use a quarantine tank. Because of how hard my water is, I almost had no issues with any fungal infections. I rarely suffered any bacterial infections. Aggression just never seemed to be much of an issue, although I did have a few cherry barbs that lost eyeballs, but they survived. Basically what I'm saying is I didn't use a quarantine tank, and for most of the time I've had fish, I never saw a reason to. The point of this video is I'm giving you guys the reason that I never realized for owning a quarantine tank. So again, why do I have one if I was so against them for so long? Well, although I dodged bacterial infection, I dodged fungal infection, I dodged all these bad things that can happen with your fish, I could not dodge probably the worst of any internal parasite or any parasite period that you could ever have in your aquarium, and those were the Camellianus worms. What feels like a long time ago now, I got a trio. Actually, I got 4 Bolivian rams. One died because it got stuck and got eaten by snails, and that's a whole other video that we'll make later on, but I got 4 Bolivian rams, and they were probably the best fish I've ever had. They were so cool. I love the mohawks they had. The behaviors that they had between them were amazing. They were peaceful, awesome fish. However, when I got them, like most fish, I didn't quarantine them. And I noticed that they stopped eating normally. I thought it was just that they didn't like flakes or pellets and they wanted some kind of more premium food, some kind of frozen food, so I started feeding that, and it was going okay. But as I started noticing other smaller, more fragile fish start to die off, I also started to notice that the Bolivian rams had small red worms hanging out of their vent. Like any good fish keeper would, I immediately started researching these red worms and soon found that they were called Camellianus worms. I thought about isolating these cichlids, but by the time that these worms are hanging out, I learned through research, is the time that they're already reproducing. And they reproduce by putting their live young, these produce live young, into the gravel so that other fish, while looking for food in the gravel, will eat them up. It was only a few weeks before every fish in the entire aquarium had these worms in their intestines. And it was not much longer after that that every fish in the entire 40-gallon aquarium died. As you probably know, parasites literally eat the food that the fish is eating while in their intestines. And once there's no more food, because eventually, like I saw in my rams, they will choose to not eat, the worms will start eating the actual fish. They will break through the intestinal cavity, and like you can see on my Farloella here, they will start eating the flesh of the fish outside of that stomach cavity. This is a suicide mission on the worms' part, because once they eat the entire fish, then the fish no longer eats, of course, and the worms all die. Now you may be thinking, what about my backup plan? What about treating the whole tank? Well, if you've been following, you know that I did do that. I used actually what is a cow deworming medication, also used on dogs and cats. The problem with it is, A, if you are in Canada, you can't get anti-parasitic medication like that unless you get it from a vet, which is very expensive. And B, medications like these are non-water soluble, which means that you have to actually put it into the fish's digestive tract for it to have any effect on the worms. Now, I learned later on, unfortunately, that the vet gave me the wrong medication for treating worms, that there's actually a paralytic. If you guys are having issues with this kind of worm and you want specific treatment, just let me know and I can walk you through it. But the point is, I have a quarantine tank now because I realized that you can't just treat fish after they're in the main display tank. It is always better to treat fish before you put them in the display tank in a quarantine tank, because especially in a quarantine tank, you can have it so that there is no substrate. With these worms, they breed in the substrate. Their eggs or their live young go into the substrate. This makes them easier to deal with, and if you're not able to deal with them, at least they're away from your display tank. Now, there are other types of parasites that are easier to remove, such as ick. I know ick is easier to remove than these camellianus worms. Also anchor worms, water lice, stuff like that. Easier to remove, that you could probably get rid of in your display tank. At least better than you would be able to get rid of camellianus worms, but it's always better to have a quarantine tank to at least analyze these fish for about a month. Yeah, I know, I said a month, before you put them in your display tank. So if you are looking to keep multiple fish, I urge you to keep a quarantine tank so that when you get new fish, the parasites don't spread to the old fish. It's easy to think that you can just give them a quick glance at the store, assess if they have parasites, and hey, if they look good, then just throw them right in your display tank, because some of these parasites take months to develop. For instance, I have a whiptail catfish in this tank that, if you guys have seen my previous videos, actually I'll put the video right here, but I got a whiptail catfish and he's super cool, and I want to put him in here so bad, but he has been producing the kind of waste. Now this is where you guys need to do the research. Check what signs there are, early signs of these kind of parasites. Now with external parasites, you're going to see them, but with internal parasites, you have to look at the feces of the fish. So one of the things that you have to look at is the color of the waste. So with camellianus worms, what you have to look at is if the waste is clear, if it's white, if it's stringy, if there's any contents in it, basically. Because if it's white and stringy, if there's no contents to it, like say if you're feeding bloodworms to your fish and the color of the waste is white, that's not what the color of the waste should be, because the worms in the fish are eating all the nutrients. What's coming out is just all the basically the worm's waste, not the fish's waste. It is so much more annoying to have an awesome fish like this in quarantine for 3 months instead of having him in the display tank where I wanted him, but it has so much more benefits to it in the long run, because now all these fish are safe. So the moral of the story is, get yourself a little quarantine tank. It's going to save you a lot of trouble. You're going to avoid a lot of different types of parasites, fungal infections, bacterial infections, aggression. You're going to be able to watch fish breed, which is pretty cool. You can raise up some fry in there, and eventually you'll probably turn it into a display tank and then just end up with multiple tank syndrome. It's kind of how it starts. If you guys like this video, make sure you leave it a like. I really appreciate it. If you want to see what's going on with the new beta I got and I'm trying to treat in this tank, as well as the whiptail catfish and all the other tank updates, make sure you guys subscribe and you won't miss it. And I will see you guys next Sunday.